It's that time of the week again. It's tutorial time because, of course, as I'm sure you're already aware, it's Tutorial Tuesday. Welcome back to Tutorial Tuesday, where each and every Tuesday we bring a brand new, fresh photography tutorial. This week, of course, is no different, but what we are going to do that is different is actually hand over to Sony photographer Andrew Whyte, who's going to talk us through his approach to astrophotography, which I think is really interesting. Now, he's actually going to be doing this in a local area to me around sort of Beachy Head, which is a great dark sky spot. I've gone up and taken loads of photos, the Milky Way up there, all kinds of stuff. I love doing astrophotography up there, but it's really interesting to get someone else's perspective and see someone else's approach to doing this. So I'm going to hand over to Andrew now, and we're going to go through all things astrophotography. Andrew.
Thanks, Gareth, for that introduction. My original A7S and FE lenses have been a part of my photography for more than 7 years, and in that time they've had a hard life, being used for hour-long light painting images, all-night star trails and award-winning Milky Way landscapes. They continue to deliver. It's what I'm using to shoot this film, but with one eye on the future, I decided it was time to look at some replacement alternatives. Like many of us, I've got a lot of lost time to make up for, so this year I've committed to spending a night out each month under the stars. For January, I've just got to hope that these clouds clear. I'm in the South Downs with the Sony A7R Mark IV and the 12-24 f4 zoom lens. And the reason I'm huddled into this tiny tent is because I'm hoping to use the lens's ultra-wide angle to gain a fresh perspective on star trails looking out of the tent door. The camera's going to be running for a long time, so I want to stop any mist from forming on the lens. So I'm just using this old sock wrapped around the lens, and I'll put some of these hand warmers inside. It's a properly dark location, so my ISO of 2000 reflects that. I've dialed in f4, the lens's widest aperture, and my 30-second exposure time is the longest I can select. I'll then trigger the camera over and over with a cable release and leave it running for an hour or more. With the camera mounted upside down in such a small space, the companion app on my phone gives me access to not only the viewfinder but all settings. That's what you're seeing now, and yes, I've since noticed the button to invert the image. Upside downness aside, it takes all of the guesswork out of composition and is invaluable to be able to control the camera remotely. Orion's dead centre in this frame, a test shot to check for sharpness. I can leave the camera to do its thing while I grab a brew. For any star trail, I'll also start or finish with a longer duration frame at lower ISO to ensure I have a usable foreground. In this 5-minute frame, Orion's moved a long way west from its earlier position. I'm looking for a marker I've left on the ground so I can position myself in a final frame, though I seldom end up using it. Again, the app is so helpful to nail the position and lighting and exposure. Once I've completed my tonal edits in Lightroom, the exported JPEGs get fed into a free desktop app called StarStax. It adds new detail from each frame in a way that basically replicates Photoshop's Lighten layer blend mode. The A7R4's full-res files are bigger and, in this case, slower than I'm used to, but it still loads quicker than creating a similar stack in Photoshop. There was enough quality and detail in the stacked frames shot at ISO 2000 to negate the lower ISO frame. Orion lies across the celestial equator, so the curved trails reveal the formation of arcs of starlight around both the northern and southern pole stars. So, close to home tonight, and I'm about to head up onto an empty rooftop. I'm still using the A7R Mark IV, but this time with the 24-240 zoom lens. Starting at f3.5, the lens doesn't quite match the aperture of more specialist astro equipment, but it will more than hold its own in urban low light, with the huge zoom range adding to its versatility around town. Now the aim with a time slice is to capture a sequence of frames at regular intervals to record a changing landscape. Previously I've used this technique to show the stages of a lunar eclipse, but this time I'm shooting the transition from day to night. My preference for shooting at night is to keep the camera in full manual mode, but there's such a big shift from the highlights of sunset to the shadows of night that aperture priority gives me more flexibility. I've taken a test shot to judge my initial exposure and check focus, and it's just about time to start shooting. I've set my ISO and aperture, and the camera's built-in interval timer will take care of shutter speed, along with much of the complicated stuff. The caption tells me I'll be here till it's fully dark. It's so handy to have this built into the camera rather than having to carry or forget another item of kit. The ISO of 200 gives me the best chance of retaining detail in the highlights when exposure duration lengthens, while also giving me latitude to extract as much as possible from the camera's dynamic range. There's no concerns about depth of field in this scene, so an aperture of f8 offers sharpness across the frame, and as it's an urban location, it will never get truly dark to need more light than f8 lets in. I'm shooting raw, so I can change the white balance in post, but setting a fixed value on location, like daylight or cloudy, ensures that images I review in camera have a consistent feel. The only thing left for me to do was to keep warm, moving in increasingly quicker circles around the rooftop. Back at my desk, and after some minor tonal adjustments in Lightroom, I couldn't help pixel peeping to see just how much detail was captured by the camera, and yeah, that's a lot. And I'm well impressed how the clever tech of the interval timer coped with smoothing the transition from light to dark, fractions of a second all the way out to 10 seconds. I definitely need this feature in my next camera body. It was then just a case of picking frames for the start and end points and working out how many to include along the way, every fifth frame in the final image, but the other frames aren't wasted as the full sequence works well as a time lapse.
If you have any warm clothes with you, please put them on.
And what a prophecy that turned out to be. Now I love prime lenses, and I especially love the 50mm focal length. The 2.5 is on the left here, set against the 1.2 that I used for all the nighttime filming. The 2.5 particularly appeals because of its compact size and light weight. I wouldn't have to think twice about taking it on a bike packing overnighter when I usually try to travel as light as possible. I leave at short notice and work with whatever's in front of me. But despite this serendipitous approach, I'm seldom short of ideas, so on the island there was a few things I was looking out for. A subject to illuminate, an opportunity to capture moonlight on water, and the constellation of Orion, which fits well in the 50mm field of view. All this and more was within reach from this location, but, well. After setting the tent up, I've just had to have a really strong word with myself because I didn't want to get back out again. The wind is absolutely howling. Even without wind chill, the temperature's hovering around 0. And shooting in conditions like this really highlights the times when you need to be able to depend on your gear. And unfortunately, my lighter weight bikepacking tripod was no match for that wind. At first glance, my shots seemed okay, and it's worth making the general observation here about how this moonlit image has similar traits to a daytime shot. But it was clear through the viewfinder and here in Lightroom that the tripod's weakness was allowing vibrations to reach the camera. The tower lacks absolute sharpness, and the various points and trails of light have rendered with a distinct squiggle. This confirmed it was very much not a camera or lens issue, so all I could do was wait for the wind to die down. In between times I managed to grab a couple of frames out of the wind, and although I didn't film that process, I really want to share the results because there's incredible detail and sharpness from the camera and lens combo, not to mention really clean separation around these areas of high contrast. Notwithstanding the points of light on the horizon and a few pinpricks of starlight, again there's almost a daylight feel to this image that's actually lit by the 70% moon. Finally, things calmed down enough to resume, and I was thankful, if unsurprised, that the autofocus just latched straight on. Orion was setting by this point, giving me just long enough to create this orange glow from inside. The lighting just comes from a torch, covered with a swatch of theatrical lighting gel. It's as simple as standing out of frame and painting light over the subject with constant movement to avoid hotspots. Now we can check out the detail in the moonlit stonework. That's more like it. The bright star is Sirius, which in this shot is concealing a secret. Wanted to bag a couple of shots of home before calling it a night, but with the camera positioned against a fence, the viewfinder was inaccessible. I flicked the lens into manual mode and used the remote app once more to nail focus. The app view appears to omit the focus peaking blinkies, so here's a later example of how the coloured highlights show you where your focus is hitting, and you can see the level of precision I'm able to achieve as both the viewfinder and screen magnify the view when I turn the focus ring. Anyway, in this 10-second frame, the stars are yet to start trailing, so we get a feel for the lens's defocus characteristics. And I reckon the hazy clouds introduce an ethereal feel that the earlier clear sky shots lacked. Now I've got just enough time left to tell you about one last lens that I've been using, and if the 50mm is tiny, this really isn't. The 200 to 600 is not an obvious long exposure lens, but I've been using it across several lunar phases and I'm over the moon with the results. I need to confess that for the most part I ignored the zoom and shot at 600mm because I couldn't get enough of that reach. In fact, I was often taking advantage of the A7R4's crop mode, creating an effective 900mm lens while still getting 26MP images from the huge sensor. It's worth noting that the longer focal length you shoot, the faster a moving object like the moon will appear to travel across the width of the frame, like here as it passes behind a distant telegraph pole. Imagine trying to chase that perfect alignment. And of course, the magnification of longer lenses really amplifies tiny vibrations. Or it would, were it not for the steady shot function that works to counter small movements. And it does work, but mostly you notice that by missing it if it's switched off. All of that explains why this, like any telephoto, is not really a lens for long exposures. But the moon's generally bright, and when shooting it you can often be in the exposure range of hundredths of a second, so that works out okay. I mostly used it on a tripod with a 2-second delay to further eliminate vibrations, but the steady shot allowed me to get some shots handheld. For the most part, circumstances meant I was shooting when the moon was well risen, so I've got many frames of it just suspended in darkness. Not quite enough yet to make an HDR image with lots of texture, but for sure I've caught plenty of detailed craters along the terminator between light and shade. As a sign of how fickle a pursuit it is to shoot the moon, across a month I managed one decent but imperfect frame aligning the moon with a landmark. I asked a lot from the camera and lens for this, and a brief moment of cloud almost scuppered it completely. And what about Sirius, whose secret I mentioned earlier? A contact of mine on Twitter inspired me to investigate its apparent twinkling, scintillation caused by light passing through a turbulent atmosphere. Deliberately defocusing the lens makes the point of light appear larger and reveals its colourful dance, either as a video or in a collage of stills. Just before I hand back to our host and dwell on my upgrade path, I'll share a couple more stills that I caught along the way. The latest features of the A7R4 in particular have given me a huge amount of food for thought. And the perspective of the 12-24 was so night-grabbingly wide. And then there's the quality from that 50mm that defied its size.
Thank you, Andrew. That was great to see, and it's really interesting to get some other people's perspective on some of these topics. We've talked about astrophotography in the past, but it's lovely to see kind of a hands-on demonstration of how Andrew actually approaches that. Now, if there's anything in particular you'd like to see in a future Tutorial Tuesday, let me know down in the comments, because as you may know, we cover all kinds of topics. Editing, actual practical photography, we can cover various different programs. Let me know what you'd like to see down in the comments, and I'll do my absolute best to get to it. I know there are some suggestions already, which I absolutely have noted down in a nice little list, which we will be getting to. You can also check out all the gear that Andrew is talking about by checking the link down in the description. Don't forget to like and subscribe as well if you enjoyed the video. There'll be new content all the time, including, of course, new tutorials every Tuesday, and maybe there's some other stuff coming. Ooh. So keep your eyes peeled to the channel, of course. Until then, as always, the only thing left for me to say is, of course, thanks for watching.